Excellent. Dr. Walsh, hello.
Hello, Gavin. Have you had a good week?
I have. I've had a most wonderful week. Do you want to talk about your week first? Because your week was very interesting. I don't want to.
No, my week. My week has been a week of bathroom refitting, hotel stays, and broken promises on the part of Wiltshire Council, which has left me unable to write my Substack piece that I wanted to write on Wittgenstein and Popper and the poker incident, which I think we're going to talk about today. But there's no excuse for that because Wittgenstein wrote his most famous fighting in the trenches of the First World War. So I have no excuse for that. But it's been an interesting up and down week, but all is well because the people I love are fine. Oh, and we had a wonderful service of reconciliation at the church on Tuesday for Lent. Bishop came, and there were
that's very good.
five stations for confession, which was wonderful. And that was good. So it's been a good week just because of that.
Mixed, but having to stay and endure the cost of a hotel is difficult.
Yeah.
I've had a very exciting week. I was invited to have dinner with Father Aidan Nichols, who is my hero, and I've run out of heroes. The last 20 or 30 years, I've not been able to find any. So to discover there are still giants walking amongst us, I had the most marvelous evening's dinner with him, and was just astonished at being in the presence of that incredible combination of great learning and also great spirituality. They don't often go together, but they do in him. And also his amazing friend, Father John, who was the parish priest, and Hilaire Belloc's great grandson,
That's
Roderick,
amazing.
who was also there.
That is.
Yes.
And this was in Oxfordshire, is that right?
Yes, that's right. And yes, just Aidan is teaching in Oxford, and so it was St Binus Parish, just south of Oxford, where he stays. One of amazing such people and such dinner parties and such conversations, because I have been short of dinner parties and conversations for a while.
I know of Father Nichols that is he father or canon? Is he? He's OP.
No, he's father. He's father.
I know Father Nichols that he's a scholar of Van Balthasar, and I did send you a message last night asking if you discussed Hans von Balthasar, and not only that, but certain compliments were made. Anyway, perhaps you don't want to talk about that. I don't know.
No, I don't. No, we can forget that. I mean, I don't know how to manage compliments. Can you manage compliments? I can't.
I don't get many compliments.
You get from me. I pour compliments towards you. I'm
do.
in awe of your learning, and I do. I really do. I've even given you semi-homoerotic compliments, which in the wrong company and wrong context could be misunderstood. But since we're both, I think, enthusiastically straight, they're unambiguous. But they are nonetheless well meant.
Enthusiastically straight, but out of practice. In my case,
Let's not go there.
Yes, that's taken a turn, hasn't it?
We'll say our prayers, and as the outer body crumbles, so the inner soul continues to intensify. Especially in your case, well, my outer body is crumbling. I don't know if the inner soul is intensifying, but the crumbling I know all about.
We had. I was actually.
Am I older than you? I think I must.
Yeah, you are older than me. I'd like to emphasise that point.
Obviously. You don't need to. It was stupid. It was the first of many stupid questions that the rest of the day is going to talk about. We're going to talk. Do you want to talk about your walk, or should we go on to Popper and the poker?
No, let's go to Popper and the poker. Shall I set the stage? Shall I set the scene?
Yes, please do.
This is the second of our discussions about encounters between philosophers that kind of became notorious. This one took place in Cambridge in 1946 at King's College at a meeting of what's known as the Cambridge Moral Science Club, which is basically the philosophy club because moral sciences is philosophy at Cambridge. I think it still is, actually, isn't it? Anyway, Wittgenstein was a fellow at Cambridge at this point, Popper was kind of 10 years younger than Wittgenstein. Now, Wittgenstein's early work had been to do with theories of meaning, their relationship to logic, the relationship between logic and mathematics. His later work was kind of spun off in a different direction. Some people would say a direction that's sort of a refutation of his earlier work. I don't happen to agree with that. But Wittgenstein came to the opinion that his early work didn't take account of the wonderful flexibility of language, and that language is not merely there just to describe the world, but does other things as well. And Wittgenstein had come to the opinion that philosophers were getting themselves into binds, intellectual binds, by misusing language, and that many of the things that they took to be philosophical problems were just basically kind of illusions, and that once one studied what language was doing, a lot of those problems would disappear. Similar to a view he had held in his youth, actually, which was articulated in the Tractatus. At the end of the Tractatus, there's the famous Proposition 7, where Wittgenstein says, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent," which was taken at the time, wrongly, to be a kind of refutation or a disavowal of metaphysics and ethics and all the other things that philosophers like to talk about, but wasn't really. It was more of a call for a kind of reverential attitude to those interesting questions which can't be necessarily captured in language. If you like, the view there would be that language is a kind of the enforcement mechanism for humility. There are some things we just can't talk about. It doesn't mean they're not there in some other way. Anyway, at this meeting,
Can I just put in a 5-second bracket? Just a 5-second bracket. It's the apophatic tradition of spirituality.
yes,
There are things that should not be spoken. Language cannot bear some of the weight that ultimate reality requires. And so at that point, I mean, he's often described as mystical, whatever that means.
yeah,
But it also means he wasn't a logical positivist, which you may come to. Sorry, wasn't sure if there was a moment to interrupt or not.
No, that's you make a very good point. In the Tractatus, Wittgenstein is basically saying that there is a more than coincidental similarity between the structure of logic and the structure of the world, and that at a certain point, the world and logic intersect with each other. Now, what that means is that the world is kind of constrained by what you can say about it. What you can say about it has very pellucidly clear criteria, the criteria that logic give us. Once you start to go up beyond those limits that logic sets, it's not that you're talking nonsense, it's that you shouldn't be talking at all. So yes, you're right. It's consistent with the apophatic tradition. I wrote a piece for The Other Place about this, actually, on arguing that Wittgenstein's Tractatus is actually properly understood as an anti-reductivist piece of work, but was appropriated by people who had a different agenda, the Viennese circle, the logical positivists that you mentioned. Anyway,
and in lay language, that means in lay language, it means that was a jolly nice thing to do, but people misused it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that's important because when people say that Wittgenstein in his later works is contradicting his earlier works, a lot of the people saying that haven't really understood the earlier works or are being mischievous with what the earlier works were attempting to say themselves.
Will you take a question, Professor, at this stage, or do you want them later on?
No, go for it.
So my schoolboy understanding of the difference between early Wittgenstein and late Wittgenstein was that I thought I liked early Wittgenstein more than late because he appeared to give greater credibility to the preeminence of reality that language was intended to serve. And then you can say that late Wittgenstein changed that, and then you can say that either in a positive or negative way. You can either say, which would be positive, that he realized the complexities of language. If you like, language was a doorway to reality, and unless you got the keys for the door right, you wouldn't get in. So you needed to sort your language out, or you couldn't make language work properly. Language became a problem that obscured reality, wouldn't let you in. Or you can say more destructive, which I think is the view that I've understood, rightly or wrongly, was that he gave greater preeminence to language rather than reality. And that, if you like, the epistemology, the authority that words had, was more important than the thing they were trying to describe. Can you clear up my schoolboy error?
No, I think that's a fair point. I think the other way of characterizing the move from the Tractatus to the later work is that the Tractatus, when it talks about propositions in language, is really talking about thought. And
Yes.
the later Wittgenstein is talking about language, which could also take a behavioral form, so speech and the other things we use language to do, to instruct, to cajole, to interrogate. In both cases... Sorry, go on.
Would it be true to say that that particularly late Wittgenstein was more concerned with the method of getting to truth than to truth itself? On the Tractatus principle, you couldn't speak about truth, but what you could speak about was the mechanism of getting there, and that he began to try and to make that as uncomplex and straightforward as possible, the mechanism rather than the thing itself. Or is that too simple?
By looking at the way language is actually used in real communities and in real forms of life. Yes, that's right. I mean, the later Wittgenstein is kind of less a metaphysician and more philosopher as therapist. The philosopher,
more mechanic. Yes.
Wittgenstein was a mechanic. Wittgenstein started off studying aeronautical engineering at Manchester University, became interested in mathematics, heard about Bertrand Russell, who was obviously very interested in mathematics and attempted to give an account of the nature of mathematics in Principia Mathematica and in other places. And so Wittgenstein basically went straight to Cambridge and sought out Russell and said, let's talk. But he was a trained mechanic. He was also an architect, quite famously. And a very, very, very engineering mind.
But that's terribly exciting because, I mean, maybe my unconscious was working over time, but I don't know that I knew he was a mechanic. But I was beginning to sense that he was working at the mechanics of meaning. So if he really was a mechanic, and I'm sure you're right, and an architect, then of course he'd be interested in the structural integrity of the building and the project as much or more than the project itself. I mean, that would be where his gifts would lie and what he did. Yes. No. Okay. Well, this is brilliant. You've helped me understand Wittgenstein for the first. I've got it. I like that very much. Thank you, Sim. This is really
it's interesting
one of those moments of disclosure.
It's interesting that he did that, by which I mean seeking out Russell. Wittgenstein was from a fabulously wealthy family in Vienna. His father, Karl, was basically owned the steel industry. So we're talking billionaires here. We're talking Carnegie level wealth. He was the youngest of, I think, about 8 or 9 children, so 7 or 8 siblings, 2 of whom committed suicide. Wittgenstein spent his entire life worried that he would go mad. And as I say, he was the youngest and was not artistically inclined. 2 of his brothers were artists and concert pianists, actually.
Yes, it wasn't it Wittgenstein that Ravel wrote the left-handed piano concerto for?
It was Wittgenstein's brother, yes, because he only had one arm.
Yes, I meant yes, the brother, yes, yes.
So my point is that Wittgenstein was used to. I mean, the family knew Brahms, and those were the circles they moved in.
Wow.
So whereas you and I at the time might have sent Russell a telegram, or maybe a telegram to Russell's footman or mistress, of whom there were several. Wittgenstein said, "Well, I'll just go and see him," because that's the way he lived. That was the upbringing. And famously, Russell didn't know what to make of this person, and said to him after a few months putting up with him, "Look, write something down, and I'll let you know you're either an idiot or a genius. I can't pick it up. Write something down." And Wittgenstein said, "No, you're a genius. The future of philosophy is with you."
Yes.
Getting back to the meeting, getting back to the moral science thing. Karl Popper, who was born in 1900, died in 1994, was at this point 10 or 11 years younger than Wittgenstein. No one was as well established as Wittgenstein, but was just getting established in the academic world. We've got to remember this is on the back of the Second World War, so there's all that going on. Popper is invited to give a paper to this club, and somewhat mischievously says he will give a paper on the subject of, are there genuine philosophical problems? And of course, Wittgenstein was taken to be coming to the point of view that they weren't. So it was a provocative and interesting, thing for Popper to decide to talk about. Now, this is when things get unclear because, to use that expression, recollections vary. Wittgenstein apparently got terribly cross in the course of this and was fiddling with a poker, and it's always a red hot poker, Gavin, in the accounts. It's important to mention that the poker was red hot, and he was fiddling with it in a kind of threatening way. So presumably they were worried about, because it was a red hot poker, they were worried about he was going to brand someone, possibly Popper or whatever, rather than strike them with this red hot poker. And at one point, Wittgenstein says, according to some accounts, give me an example of a genuine moral principle. And Popper's reply was, not threatening visiting speakers with a poker. At which point, Wittgenstein threw the poker back in the fireplace and storms out. And thus a legend was born. Like I say, accounts of what actually happened from people in the room vary, and kind of, the rule/test applies here as well. They kind of divide along party lines, if you like. So Wittgenstein's acolytes, of whom there were many in the room, say that Popper always exaggerated this account because Popper writes about it in his memoirs. Whereas other people who were kind of not so fond of Wittgenstein because he was a take him or leave him kind of guy say, no, Wittgenstein did behave appallingly on the night. My suspicion is that Wittgenstein would have forgotten about the whole thing 30 seconds later and been on to thinking about something else. But that's the famous incident. And there's a wonderful book on this by David Edmonds, who co-hosts the Philosophy Bites podcast with Nigel Warburton, and a journalist called John Idenau, I think is how you pronounce his name, called Wittgenstein's Poker, in which they draw together the various accounts of what happened on the evening, contrast them, and kind of by implication, also they give good summaries of Wittgenstein's philosophy and Popper's. Popper was an interesting philosopher as well, by the way. Maybe we can come to him in a minute. And it struck me, as I said to you on the phone the other day, that if one thing is proven, it's that there are genuine philosophical problems. One of them being, if different people remember an event from years ago in completely different ways, A, did that event happen?
Mm.
B, what's the truth about that event? Or is the truth known only to God? So that's kind of very roughly what happened, but it's kind of that's what passes for a dust-up in Oxbridge circles. Although I probably, like you, I've been academic papers that have worse things than that have happened. But
oh yes, we have some stories. So it seems to me that how can we make use of this as Catholics? First of all, the recognition that there was a breakdown of communication between them. They clearly didn't understand each other because they were setting about or representing different tasks. And I think this notion of breakdown of communication is essential, because one experiences it on the internet all the time. Somebody says something, they're often misheard, or very often heard with a kind of predisposition. We tend to be afraid we're going to hear certain things, or are ready to be enraged, and when they happen, we make certain assumptions. And I don't think it's just, problematically, I don't think it's just words. I was once at a Jungian conference where run by some nuns, actually, and I and a friend, both of whom had trained for the bar, were taken to be overt examples of a particular cast of mind. And so this kind of test group were invited to discuss things with the audience. And the audience were going to be asked to sort of do a jury vote on what we'd said and whether they liked what we said. And each person on the stage was a particular example of a Jungian psychological trait. And so the two extreme people, me and this other all trained barrister, we got into terrible trouble with the audience, who absolutely hated us. Now, we both thought we were bringing a degree of logical clarity and synthesis to the whole thing. But when asked why they hated us, they said, because that bastard, that bigot said this. As it happened, somebody was taking down all the conversation in shorthand. And so they're able to say, no, they didn't say that. They said something else. So we patted ourselves on the back and said, hooray, we've been vindicated. But the really important thing was the words weren't heard. Other words were heard. Different meanings were inferred.
Yeah.
And essentially what I thought this was very useful from Jung pointing out, because, one of the things that happened in academic committees was you saw, Jung had this thing about thinking and feeling, coherence and intuition, you might say. So in committees, you discover people just completely talking past each other, using words that at face value ought to be understandable, but coming from a psychological space or a contoured psychology that meant they were almost like talking different languages. And it seems to me that this partly describes Popper and Wittgenstein, in the sense that Wittgenstein was saying, I don't think there are moral problems, but I suspect he might not even recognize one when he was presented with one, which is maybe why the poker episode was so dramatic. But it wasn't Wittgenstein's concern to delineate the metaphysics or ontology of problems, but it was Popper's. So they were both setting about two different tasks, and each one reprimanding the other for not being good at or being concerned at the task that they themselves were doing. That's more of a classic case of misunderstanding than actually a failure of philosophy or even an intellectual disagreement about agreed essentials.
I think at the time Wittgenstein was very exercised by the fact he couldn't get his points across, and was because his work was perceived as being so very different from his work as a younger man. Russell said about Wittgenstein at this point. Russell was in the room, by the way, at this meeting. Bertrand Russell.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he was there, and I get the impression that Popper was. I think Popper had kind of approached Russell. Poor old Russell gets approached by everyone, angling for the invitation, and I think Popper probably picked the fight. But anyway, Wittgenstein Wittgenstein used to spend a lot of time arguing with himself. I mean, his lectures weren't really lectures in the way that you and I might have lectured. I mean, he would stand there in front of students and basically agonize a question that it was almost like he was arguing with himself about it. So how aware he was of precisely Popper as an interlocutor is possibly up for debate anyway. But he was accused basically...
But doesn't it prove both their points?
Yeah, it probably does.
Doesn't it prove both their point? Well, in the sense that Wittgenstein was saying, you can't talk about something properly unless you can find the right language. Please listen to me. I'm trying to find the right. Don't write off what I say.
Yeah,
I'm constructing the keys to open a door, and everyone else would say, well, we don't recognize as a locked door. We don't see the language issues you see. We see the object or the lack of the object in the room, and that's all we want to talk about that. And so in one sense, Wittgenstein was right saying, but you're not paying attention to my offer to unlock the door using a different philosophy of linguistics. And Popper was right in saying, well, I don't think the door's locked. I think I can see there's a problem. Which you're not paying attention to.
Yeah.
So
I think Wittgenstein famously said that he thought it was the job of the philosopher to help the fly back out of the bottle. So when Popper says, I'm going to talk on the subject of whether there are genuine philosophical problems, I expect Wittgenstein thought, well, for goodness sake, I've never said there aren't. My point is that the way in which philosophers and everyone uses language generates a kind of false consciousness about the nature of what those problems are. So
can I suggest a way that applies to us?
Yeah.
The way it applies to us and the people listening to us is that the word God, I think, is immensely problematic. And I think if Wittgenstein was here, he would say, well, what are you using this word for? Because it's obviously going to cause you the most immense difficulties. You must reconsider whether there's a God or not. You must reconsider using that word, because it has, rather like love, it has 100 different meanings. And when you enter a conversation, do you bother to tell people what you intend them to understand when you use that word? And the answer is no, nobody does. And you have people talking against each other, and in their heads, they've got an entirely different gallery of meanings which they're attaching to this word, and which they talk past each other. And I think one of the things that we do as Catholics is we assume that people have in their head the same pictures that the words that we're using are intended to represent, and they don't at all. In other words, we could do with listening to Wittgenstein and clear up our language a bit and pay a bit more attention to it if we want to communicate what really matters, which is a substantial and complex reality that lies behind the words.
Yes, I think that's true. There was actually a Wittgensteinian school of philosophy of religion / theology at, I think it was either at Swansea or Cardiff. D.Z. Phillips was behind
Oh,
it.
how interesting.
So they kind of looked
Right.
at the function of religious language and said, that's what theology should be about at this particular moment in time. I don't know how that stands with the fact that as Catholics we stand up every Sunday and make truth claims in the form of the creed. What's going on there? I mean,
Well, we make them, but we make them internally. We make them to one another, don't we? We don't. I mean, one of the great misunderstandings was an Anglican. I remember as an evangelical Anglican, I believe in the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. I went, Catholic? I'm not a Catholic. Why are we using that word?
Yeah.
I had no idea that it was a derivative from Catholicos and didn't, meant something different. But anyway, so let's take your point because I've brushed over it and gone somewhere else. So when we use language in the liturgy, surely this is language that catechumens have been prepared for. It isn't. I mean, one of the things that I think is a problem is that we expect people to walk into church and understand what's going on, whereas we should have a catechumenate. I'm very impressed by the there was a point when in the early church they would say catechumens out. You're not equipped to deal with this. When we celebrate the mystery of the Mass, you'll misunderstand it. You'll imagine we're eating babies, as our critics say. So you can only stay for that which you have been prepared. Isn't all our liturgical language, in a sense, the preserve or the reserve for catechumens?
Yeah. It's our religious language is one language game among many. Is the way that Wittgenstein would put it.
Yeah. Game. Oh well, Wittgenstein would call it a game.
Yeah. The concept is very important.
No, he does.
In the philosophy of the later Wittgenstein.
Yeah,
and you need to be properly inculcated into the rules of that game, which includes looking at practice as well as what's said. We that's what formation is, isn't it? And that's what catechesis is.
I mean, one of the things that's always preoccupied me a bit, I mean, you might be able, again, to help me clear my thoughts about it, is that it seems to me the way the church operates in a post-Christian as opposed to pre-Christian culture or mid-Christian culture is different. So in a mid-Christian culture, people through education have a rough understanding of what you're talking about because it's been spread, however incompetently, through society. But in a pre- or post-Christian culture, we can't assume that people have any understanding, and therefore we need to essentially make sure that the catechumenate, or we need to recognize we're a mystery religion, and we're a form of mystery religion anyway, and it's not therefore rationally obvious what we're talking about. And if somebody approaches us saying, there's something about you that I really like, perhaps the holiness, the kindness, the compassion of the practitioners, where does this come from? Then we need to have a sort of waiting room in which we begin to explain the terms we're using and why we're using them, because for a mystery religion to a rational inquirer, there's a big gap. I don't think that we as a church serve our evangelistic responsibilities properly without having a kind of waiting room. I used to do this at the University of Sussex by having a group called Skeptics Anonymous, where people could come and without any expectation, they'd subscribe to anything at all, articulate their existential and ontological doubts, and do it in a not exactly. I pretended it was a value-free atmosphere because there was no such thing, but one in which answers weren't assumed or imposed. So I think but I've always thought Alpha's a bit like that, but not quite. I mean, Alpha's catechumenical process.
I was thinking about
what the right word is.
I was thinking about RCIA, not Alpha, but I suppose it's the same point.
Yeah.
I've never done the Alpha course actually, so I don't know about that. But I have been a catechist for RCIA.
What do you think about when people come into your RCIA courses? Do you find that how close are they in the process to understanding what the church believes? If you can generalize that, or perhaps you can't.
I think I've not done catechesis for a couple of cycles, but I used to, in terms of work and prep, get them to read the Church Fathers and attend the Mass. I mean, my view is that everything you need to know you can learn by attending the Mass through a fairly slow.
I agree completely. Yes.
Yeah. Because this, as you say, we're a mystery religion, we're a faith. We can't be really properly understood, merely propositionally. It's the process of formation isn't like that. I'm wondering if I should say something more about Popper, though, because we've only talked about one side of the dispute.
Whatever pleases you. Whatever pleases you will please our listeners.
I don't know about that. Well, 1946, Popper was a relatively young man, late 40s, I guess, mid to late 40s. He had written a book called The Open Society and Its Enemies, which I think was published around about the time of the outbreak of the Second World War, or maybe just after. People have to check that, because I've been watching Peaky Blinders on Netflix with my son rather than doing homework for this. So there you go. There's my. I think it was about 6 or 7 years. So he had a certain reputation in Open Society and Its Enemies, which was a very serendipitous, if that's the right word, attack on the nature of totalitarianism, in which that's the work in which, curiously, he singles out as examples of philosophical tyrants Plato. Yeah, I can see where that's coming from.
Oh yes, that's
Hegel.
right.
Hegel seems a bit unfair. I can't quite remember the arguments in the book for why Hegel was so bad. And Marx, Marx that's just a given, isn't it? That Marx was awful. But in the later part of his career, he became more interested and more famous for his work in the philosophy of science, and was another philosopher like Wittgenstein. He was kind of mistaken and taken for granted by the positivists of the Vienna Circle. Popper came up with a thing called the principle of verification, which is a criterion for separating science from pseudoscience, or science from fake science. And Popper proposes that for a claim to be genuinely scientific, or for a body of claims to add up to a genuinely scientific theory, there must be some circumstances in which it could, in principle, be falsified. Otherwise, it's not telling you anything. So, for example, astrology would fall foul of that, because whatever happens, the astrologer can just adjust their predictions. Nowadays, I think the obvious candidates for pseudoscience would be climate change, catastrophism, and net zero stuff, and probably anything involving modelling. But
Yes.
This was very specifically to do with what delineates or marks off something as being a genuinely scientific claim from something that just pretends to be. But he was appropriated by the logical positivists as proposing a kind of verificationist theory of meaning of the sort that they liked. So as applying to everything, all sorts of propositions, which wasn't what Popper was concerned to do. So those Vienna Circle types were very pesky and rapacious when it came to the ideas of other people.
That's another example of people not listening to the intention of their interlocutor, or either carelessly or willfully misunderstanding, and then misapplying. And so
his philosophy of science are in two reasonably big books, one called The Logic of Scientific Discovery, and another one called Conjectures and Refutations, both of which are worth reading, but they're not widely read enough. When I was teaching philosophy of science at Liverpool a long time ago, I was urging for those to be part of the, to at least one of them to be a primary text, but without much success. He spent a lot of his career at the London School of Economics, lived in Buckinghamshire, quite near where I was brought up, actually, in Penn, and had a famous kind of intellectual rivalry and friendship with a philosopher of mathematics called Imre Lakatos, who was also a murderer, by the way, if you want to go into that, who kind of didn't like the verificationist program. He thought science didn't work like that. And just to throw into the mix, there was another philosopher of science, slightly later, but around about the same era, who was absolutely batshit crazy, called Paul Feyerabend, who argued against the idea of there being such a thing as the scientific method, in a book called Against Method, as it happens. Feyerabend is the guy who probably came up with the claim or the theory that minds don't exist. So that's how crazy Feyerabend was. Terribly engaging writer and a very fascinating man. So I don't think Wittgenstein...
Depends on what you mean by mind and what you mean by exist.
Well, he said that it's similar. We discussed in Limited Materialist a couple of weeks ago, I think, but just to recap very quickly, if the science of the brain, if neuroscience finds it hard to make use of common sense psychological concepts like intention, belief, desire, then is that a problem for the neuroscience, or is that a problem for common sense psychology? And Feyerabend says you could just as easily choose to do away with common sense psychology, dispute the neuroscience. And, we can construe, when we talk about our mental lives, when we say we're going to the dentist because we have a toothache, or I don't believe I'm going to go to church because it's Friday and I've got something else on. When we do that, you could argue that we're actually operating a theory about what's going on in our own minds. And if it's a theory, then in principle, it could be replaced by another theory, which is a better one. So the neurosciences, in principle, could be a better theory of what's going on in our minds, on the assumption that our minds are our brains. So sorry, I got a bit complicated there. I didn't mean to.
I think the problem with all that is the assumption, is the empirical assumption. I mean, from my point of view, I've absolutely no idea what's going on in my mind, let alone my unconsciousness. I have the greatest of difficulty. It's like riding a horse.
Right. Something, and sorry,
it's like riding a horse.
But we can then circle back to later Wittgenstein, who, in developing this new theory about what philosophy should be doing and the emphasis upon language, has a brilliant attack upon that Cartesian conception of the mind as being this private thing that we've talked about before. Wittgenstein, in the Philosophical Investigations, which was his lecture notes, which were published posthumously and diaries, has what's called the private language argument. If we have private mental inner states like beliefs, desires, pains, etc., then we must have some way of referring to them. And if we have some way of referring to them and they're private, that way of referring to them must be something like a private language, a language that only I understand, the grammar of which only I get, the referential objects of which only I can perceive. And he argues that such a language would be impossible because you'd have no way of telling when you were going wrong and when you weren't. So he uses...
So I'd like to...
So to those, I'll just finish on this, otherwise I'll forget to say it, Gavin. So to those people who say that Wittgenstein in his later years wasn't thinking seriously about philosophy, he came up with one of the better anti-reductionists, one of the better better anti-privacy, one of the better anti-Cartesian critiques of the last 150 years, I would have said. So he did some pretty serious work for a guy who was just fiddling around with language, is what I would say to his detractors. Sorry, I jumped in there.
No, it's difficult to know when, because some of these passing points are so interesting that one wants to catch them on the grounds that A, they're complicated, and B, one will lose them. So it's hard to know when to jump in. Also, there's always a bit of time lag on the internet, so we apologise to our listeners. We're trying to be as skillful and as courteous as we can, and failing. I wanted to say that I'm always looking for the cash value of an idea. I'm not an intellectual. I'm not sufficiently intellectual to live just in the world of the intellect. I want to know how it's going to work because I have difficulty working as a human being. And so my sense is that there is a Catholic anthropology here which we're entitled to defend, and I'm going to express it in a very primitive and simplistic way. I'm sorry about that, but it seems to me that I, for example, am aware of there being three components to to who I am. One is my consciousness, and I don't understand how that works at all. I can see that, that I was very interested for a while in psychologically in temporal lobe epilepsy, because it's the part of the brain that appears to be closest to where you can register mystical experiences. So the reductionists would always say the mystical experience is a form of temporal lobe epilepsy. It just shows how nonsensical empiricists are. But to the point being that first of all, consciousness is impossible to describe. I think I saw an academic. So someone was suggesting, how do you deal with an intellectual atheist? And the answer was, it was Lennox. Lennox was doing it and saying, just tell me what consciousness is. And then if you keep on telling me I can't tell you what God is and can't describe it, then that's true. But you can't describe consciousness. So you're in no better a place as an atheist. So that's the first thing. I'm aware of being conscious and can't describe it. But then I'm also aware of my unconsciousness, because it appears to me, obviously, in dreams and sometimes Freudian slips and other ways it emerges. And I see it, but I only see a tiny bit of it. I don't understand. I'm troubled by it. I'm in constant dialectical tension with it. And then there's my soul. And when do I experience my soul? I think I experience it when I'm praying. In other words, when consciousness is dulled and stopped, ran out of energy, the monkeys stop jattering, and when unconsciousness doesn't seem to be provoked, and the winds that blow across the water's lake are not there, and love, the love of God, which is impossible to describe. One can only talk apophatically and not cataphatically. The words won't bear the experience. But I'm aware that when I pray, particularly when I worship, even when I'm at Mass, I am my soul. My soul is most of me. And so we have this tripartite. I experience my own state of being in a tripartite way. And it seems to me that's a proper, that would fit into the Catholic understanding of anthropology. But it's as good as any of the other anthropological models that people want to impose on us. In other words, neither the science of the mind, nor the empiricists, nor the psychologists who just deal with attention and unconsciousness. They don't bring in the soul bit. I think the great beauty of Christianity and Catholic Christianity is this tripartite model, which, like the Holy Trinity, is both separate and fused into one. Inadequately fused into one in our case, but nonetheless has some unifiable, some potentiality for unification.
I think Wittgenstein talks about prayer at some points, and when I wrote that piece for the Voldemort people. I was trying to say that some of the stuff that Wittgenstein says in the Tractatus about the distinction, so we're going back to the early work now, about the distinction between being able to say something and just being able to show something, can be tied in with some of the writing that Jean-Luc Marion makes about the nature of prayer as a form of communion. It's an attempt by language to do what language cannot do. Then there's something very specific about the way prayer does that. But that tripartite anthropology of the soul, So what are the three parts, Gavin? So you've got soul.
Well, the consciousness, unconsciousness, and one soul. So if you like, because I think you have to have consciousness and unconsciousness. They are there. Augustine is often claimed as being the first Catholic theologian who discovers the unconscious. He's extraordinarily prescient or aware of it, and so we have within the Catholic tradition these three elements that I'm saying I feel aware of. But it isn't really until Freud that there is an attempt to map out in empirical terms the mind. But they strip away the soul. And I think the problem is, I think I do experience my soul. I think when one's in the spirit, when one's in awe, in love, in worship, when the absolution is pronounced in the confession, you know, something deep inside me says, I've had a bath, I'm clean, and it's not my consciousness, it's not my unconsciousness. So it must be the soul, because it's not. I'm not aware of anything else. What I'm trying to do really is not claim any super sensitivity on my part, but to say that I find that the Catholic and anthropological model of the self works very well for me, and I want to commend it to other people. And I think by stripping out either unconsciousness or the soul in terms of the empiricists, they're making a really big mistake. And of course, but one reason they're stripping it out is because they haven't been baptized, or their soul is not in a state of being energized and fed. So maybe that's a secular argument in a way. However, I'm trying to make a case for Catholic anthropology.
No, it's a good one. It was just I was just kind of trying to clarify the terms in my own head. I mean, I make 2 points. First of all, Augustine on the unconscious. You're quite right, and I'm guessing that's what the stuff in the Confessions is about. Sorry, that's what's going on when he's talking about stealing the fruit. You know, what he's trying to. What was my deeper motive when I did that? Was I rehearsing some greater sin? What was I thinking of? This is. Stealing fruit seems
yes, well, the eye.
Not real.
He's aware that the eye is multi-layered. That's right,
Yes.
and and also the sense of I am looking out for things outside there, but you were in me. So now we have an I and a me.
Yeah.
So there's Augustine all the time is aware of the multivalent, I want to go to personality disorder. Whenever I talk about that, I'm rebuked by people who know what they're talking about.
It's really important to Augustine
Anyway.
that he was doing it with other people, with other kids. That there's a kind of shared guilt thing going on as well. Is that right?
I think that's another layer to it. I mean, Augustine is retrospectively very aware of original sin, and of course, I mean, the idiots who just can't get over the fact that, if you mention sex, that original sin is transmitted sexually, because of course what that's doing is it's somehow diminishing the great God sex and making it dirty or wrong. And I mean, I don't care how original sin is passed on. All I know is it is passed on, and it neither diminishes nor augments the act of sexual intimacy.
The people who think
for that to happen,
they're the usual mistake about what causation is, aren't they? But
yeah, absolutely. Yes, that's right. Yeah, they are. Yeah.
Second thing I was going to say was it's important to remember that for Catholic metaphysics, soul belongs to the body as well. Soul is the containing principle of the.
Yes, well, I'm a Cartesian, and I'm about to write something confessing my sins. I was telling you earlier, I've discovered this wonderful man called Friedman, and I confess I'm a Neoplatonist by instinct, but I don't think that matters. I think the part of the point of being a Catholic is you get worked on. It's not just theosis; it's also the reconstruction of our inner predisposition to heresy, which is disorder. It's a form of mental disorder, heresy, and so through the whole discipline of the Holy Spirit and spiritual direction, and the discipline of the Mass, because like you, I'm sure the liturgy of the Mass does its own work. It's a form of therapy. It heals. It informs. It reconfigures. One of the reasons why we should be at Mass quite a lot is we should allow the Mass to work on our outer and inner lives, all three areas in the case that I was describing.
Yeah. It's just my preoccupation with the idea that as Catholics we can sometimes overlook the theology of the body. That's why I keep coming back to it. And
you must. It's not just anything. It's a very, very important corrective, and particularly, I hope I will provoke you into talking about it often, because my love of Plotinus and Neoplatonism and Plato means that my instincts need corrected, and you need to correct my instinct in conversation. I hope you do. I hope you will.
It's a very appropriate instinct to express when we're talking about Augustine, of course, because he was part of that school as a younger man. He was part of the Neoplatonists were important to him, and he had that way of thinking.
Well, and also he's brought up as a Manichae, and
yes, exactly.
Just
going to go. But yeah, and of course he's writing nearly 1,000 years before Aquinas came and gave us the scholastic nomenclature as well. To be fair, so okay,
Yeah.
I just thought I'd interject that. I'm chipping away at your neologism, but
Please chip away, Doctor.
in the scheme of, well, yeah, but also absorbing it as well, probably, which is no bad thing.
Well,
It's,
no, I'm sure you're
I'm
appreciating it.
imposing my
One of the things I'm trying to do is,
conversation, which is wrong of me, I guess.
I don't think you are, but I'm very glad to have. So the one is in a state of imbalance. But by the way, in brackets, I don't think we do nearly enough with the concept of balance within the spiritual tradition. I want to write something about that because I don't think many people are writing about it, or it's not to be found. But one is in a state of imbalance, and my imbalance is diminishes the function of the body, and I need to hear and be reminded of the integration between the body and the soul, which is what, as you quite rightly say, you have an instinct to do. And so I'm very grateful in our conversation when that comes out.
I think with me, and I realise I'm not the only person to have been in the situation of having mobility issues, but when I was so ill a couple of years ago and couldn't walk for so long, it kind of, I think God was working on me to say, this just shows you that the holism of the holism of the soul, the holism of the whole person, because I was thinking about the world in a different way. It wasn't just that I couldn't move; it was that the way I thought was different. We were talking a couple of weeks ago about Merleau-Ponty and bodily intentionality, and that's when I kind of got interested in when it happened to me, because I was so lucky because the gift of walking was taken away from me and then gradually and very gradually came back. So it kind of reshaped or recalibrated my wider metaphysical belief system, I think. So that's kind of why it's on my, let's say on my mind. Should I say on my mind, on my soul, on my spirit? I don't know. But
On my person, on my person.
the point about consciousness is, on my person. The point about consciousness as well, I think a lot of contemporary philosophy of mind goes wrong because they talk about this thing called consciousness as if it's a unitary thing, when it clearly isn't. They don't.
Indeed.
They don't do the requisite disaggregation that has to go on before you look at it. And certainly in the philosophy of mind in the 20th century, the argument would often be to identify a mental content like a pain and argue whether or not that pain could be identifiable with or reduced to some neurological state of the brain or the person or the body as a whole. It had no sense of the fluidity of consciousness, the flow of consciousness. That kind of was not talked about. So it's the consciousness has been not an obsession, but it's been a concern of philosophers, rightly. But most of them have always kind of misdescribed it from my point of view. Whether that's because they were working within.
Well, and you've raised the importance of late Wittgenstein.
Yeah.
So you've raised the importance of late Wittgenstein by distinguishing between the word and the concept. And again, there are people using the word to misunderstand or misrepresent the concept. So we're back to Wittgenstein. Do you need to get the concept right first so you can adapt the word to it, or does the way in which you use the word affect the nature of the way you understand the concept? I mean, essentially, Wittgenstein's trying to keep us clean, isn't he? He's trying to say, clean up your language before you try and solve the problem.
One way in which Wittgenstein probably it's not. I mean, Wittgenstein's family were Catholic, I think, and I think religion was very important to him. One of the few books that he ever said had influenced him was Tolstoy's Brief History of the Gospels, I think it's called, isn't it? That was a book that he actually had on him when he was fighting in the First World War. But there is something about Wittgenstein's later metaphysics, which is, if you like, anti-essentialist. And you mentioned concepts there. Wittgenstein says that if you say that a concept has an essence to it, or not a concept, a thing has an essence to it, it's very difficult to actually define what that thing is in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. So to give, take the concept of Englishness. I mean, every once in a while that question comes up, doesn't it? What does it mean to be English? Can you define what Englishness is? So, we start talking about, well, it's being willing to queue up. It's my own favourite is the English like to join very strange clubs. It's all about eccentricity. And Wittgenstein would say, no, just don't play that game. Say that there is such a thing as Englishness. But if you're going to ask me to define the concept of Englishness in terms of, to be English, these things have to be true and they're jointly sufficient for something to count as being English, why? We know Englishness when we see it.
But that's extremely interesting, and
so
it's a very clever and very astute way of embodying.
While we're talking about Catholic anthropology, Wittgenstein probably, and who wants to put words in a genius's mouth, but probably would say, don't make the essentialist mistake of thinking that the human person is this kind of, if we talk about them as being some kind of tripartite thing of consciousness, soul, and body, or whatever. That could be essentialist thinking of the sort that he might disapprove, which is not to say he's right, but it is to say that he might not be, his work might not be entirely conducive to a Catholic anthropology, possibly.
Well, I know that a lot of people are very uncomfortable with tripartite anthropology.
Sorry,
I talked about, but I just want to pursue your very clever use of the idea of trying to understand Englishness, because it's a political trap that is often set, and it seems to me that what you said was exactly right. We can't define Englishness, but we can define non-Englishness. So in other words, we know when somebody isn't English, but we can't tell you what being English is. In other words, again, we're stuck in the apophatic thing. It's an apophatic process. I cannot find words that together will give an adequate expression of what it is to be English, because it's kind of like a recipe. There are so many bits and they have to cook in a certain way. But I can absolutely tell you when something is not English.
Yeah.
So I mean, there'll be lots of similarities between us and the Germans in terms of genes and the way we look and certain cultural things. But the Germans do not have a dry sense of humour. And so, well, if you suddenly discovered, if you had to tell the difference between it, that's right. We're back to being falsifiable. Yes. Anyway, I just wanted to say that this is so helpful politically, because every so often politically someone will say, "Oh, you like Englishness, do you? You want to defend being English, living in your own culture? Tell me what English is." And the answer is, I can't, because that's philosophically impossible. But I can tell you what English isn't. And then English isn't. No, we know what English is.
I have done this. I have actually done this, Gavin, when asked. In fact, I've written about it, I think. I can't remember who it's for now. Anyway, that doesn't matter. When someone finds Englishness, you say, have you not read your Wittgenstein? That is a ludicrous question. That is a grammatical error. So it's not me to be able to define English.
Well, I think we're probably running out of time, but can I just say that I'm going to say in future, when people accuse me or present me with impossible questions or questions that presume an answer, I shall say, that's ridiculous. Have you not read your Wittgenstein? That's just lovely.
Why not?
And they shall say early or late. Yes, that's right.
We had a philosopher when I was in Belfast called David Archard, who's still with us, thankfully, but complete Marxist. And he came and gave a paper to the Philosophy Society, and it was entitled "What Ish My Nation," which is a line from I can't remember whose poem it is though. It might have been one of the First World War poets. It might have been Wilfred Owen, but anyway, "What Ish My Nation." And in the paper, David argued that it was because David was a commie, basically. He said, anyone who tries to define what a nation state is, I can always give you a counterexample, from which he concluded that there was no such thing as nations. Ludicrous. The argument was that bad. And anyway, our head of department, Terry O'Keefe, was a former Catholic priest, actually, said, well, obviously, David, there's a straightforward Wittgensteinian reply to this, which is that, there is no essence to nationhood in terms of being able to define it as a set of necessary and sufficient conditions, but it doesn't follow that there's no such thing as nations. And David just said, well, obviously, I just reject the Wittgensteinian critique. That was that. So in a way, he realised that it was a fairly effective one. So, so next time, I'm Irish, by the way. So
I used to tell my...
But next time someone asks you to define your Englishness, Gavin, say, have you not read The Investigator? And they'll have no comeback to that.
Yeah, I will do that. I used to teach my children No, they don't. My children. I do say to my children, if ever you, because people bluff, I say, well, if ever you get someone quoting Wittgenstein, on the grounds that he's very hard to understand, and you have to be really quite muscular and well experienced to be able to quote him and to mean it. I say, well, or ask them, do they mean early or late Wittgenstein? And then they'll crumble in front of your eyes and back up. I think we're going to stop now, but we're going to do Rousseau.
Okay, we'll stop now. But can I just say one?
No, go on. Quote the line. Go on.
Yeah, you could just say, is that before or after?
Say whatever you like.
No, I was just going to say about the Catholic thing.
Yes.
We have to remember that Wittgenstein's favourite pupil was Elizabeth Anscombe, who was a Catholic theologian as well as a philosopher. So, she wasn't just a friend of Wittgenstein's; she was kind of philosophically sympathetic to him. So there must be some crossover there. If I can just end on that.
I think that's lovely, and we could have talked more about Wittgenstein's natural sympathy to Catholicism and his Jewish grandparents who converted to be Catholic, and also to his usefulness in terms of trying to clear up the threshold of communication, which is the use of language in order. So next, because people have said to us how immensely helpful they found Professor Walsh's explanation of Descartes, but had we not considered looking at Rousseau? So we have, and we'd like to do that. Should we do that next time?
Yes, we could look at his. I was thinking about his philosophy of education, because I hadn't appreciated until recently how much that ties in with his overall metaphysics. So I'd like to talk about Rousseau, because it'll get me reading Rousseau again, who also was into walking, of course.
Yes, well, you and I have that in common. After getting knocked off my motorbike, the gift of walking was also taken away from me. I'm still trying to regain it. So I should say to our listeners, if you have found our interchange and interruptions with each other difficult, well, I'm really sorry, but it's mainly the internet. It would work better in real life, but we manage. And also, I enjoy these conversations so much, and I really don't particularly care if people are there or listening or not. But I know there are a few people who share our delight in the fact that we can have these conversations. Yes.
Don't listen to him.
Yes, good. Well, you enjoy them too.
Bring a friend.
Well, you care if there are people listening or not.
Yes.
Bring a friend. Yes. Well, that's nice. Yes. Email them to a friend you think wants to know more about.
You know that I want to do baseball caps and mugs.
Yes, no merch. We should do merch, but we haven't discovered a brand yet, have we? I mean, two old farts doesn't quite do it, and two pedantic ex-academics, whatever we called ourselves.
I've got my son working on that. Don't worry. He's into branding. He'll come up with something.
Oh, good.
You'll want to cut. Though.
Hooray. Well, try and make him... We'll give him a cut. Well, we'll absolutely do merch. I think we should do merch. I love the idea. Right. This is, as always, Dr. Walsh, it's been such fun. Thank you very much. So I think it depends on the internet being a bit slicker than it is today. It's not been very good today. Yeah.
I think that might be my end.
God bless you too. More later. God bless all our friends. And God bless all our friends, all those listeners. And as Dr. Walsh says, if you can think of anyone whose boring and empty life would be immensely touched by this conversation, forward it to them, and let the community of friends and relations increase and add to one another. Enjoy. Thank you. God bless everybody. Bye for now.